Welcome back to Outside View Scandals. Today we're diving into a royal scandal so extravagant, so excessive, so downright absurd that it makes modern celebrity drama look like a quaint tea party. Yes, we're talking about George IV, a man who managed to turn monarchy into a high-stakes soap opera long before Netflix was a thing. And his reign was filled with outrageous spending, disastrous relationships, family feuds, and enough public embarrassment to last several lifetimes. So buckle up, because this is the scandalous tale of a king who lived like a rock star and ruled like a man in deep, deep denial. But let's start with the basics. George IV was born in 1762, the eldest son of King George III. Now, George III is best known for losing the American colonies and, of course, for going mad. One might assume that his son George IV would rise to the occasion, bring stability and restore dignity to the monarchy. Spoiler alert, that did not happen. Instead, George IV spent most of his life actively avoiding responsibility while accumulating debt, mistresses and scandal upon scandal. Even as Prince of Wales, George IV had a talent for making things messy. He was a notorious womanizer, an excessive drinker, and an obsessive gambler. His love of luxury was unmatched. He spent money like it was going out of fashion, indulging in lavish parties, elaborate clothes, and enough food to feed a small army. To put it mildly, George IV was the 18th century equivalent of a trust fund kid who never learned the meaning of the word budget. Of course, no scandalous royal story is complete without disastrous romantic entanglements. And George IV was a master at turning his love life into a full-blown constitutional crisis. In 1785, he secretly married Maria Fitzherbert, a twice-widowed Catholic. And now, this was a problem for a few reasons. First, under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, George was not allowed to marry without his father's permission. And second, marrying a Catholic was basically treason for a future king. So what did George do? He married her anyway. And then he promptly pretended the whole thing never happened. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that ignoring a problem always makes it go away. But of course it didn't. George's father, King George III, was furious, and the government refused to acknowledge the marriage. So in true irresponsible fashion, George IV racked up even more debt, partied harder, and sulked until Parliament bailed him out, on the condition that he agreed to a more suitable marriage. Enter Caroline of Brunswick, one of the worst royal matches in history. George and Caroline met once before their wedding. He took one look at her, declared her repulsive, and got so drunk before the ceremony that he had to be propped up at the altar. Romantic, isn't it? Well, the marriage was a disaster from day one. They loathed each other instantly, and after producing one child, Princess Charlotte, they separated. But George IV, ever the scandal magnate, wasn't content with simply ignoring his wife. He wanted her gone permanently. When he became king in 1820, he launched an elaborate and very public campaign to divorce Caroline, accusing her of adultery. This led to the infamous Queen Caroline affair, where the British public actually sided with Caroline, seeing her as the wrong party. Crowds chanted her name in the streets, newspapers mocked George's gluttony and extravagance, and the whole thing turned into an international spectacle. And the best part? Parliament ultimately dropped the case because the whole situation was just too embarrassing. George IV had successfully made himself more unpopular than his allegedly unfaithful wife. And speaking of public opinion, let's talk about George IV's spending habits. This man did not believe in moderation. He built the opulent Brighton Pavilion, a structure so absurdly decorated that it looks like an Englishman's fever dream of India. He accumulated a wardrobe so vast that he had multiple buildings just for his clothes. And his diet? Let's just say he never met a roast he didn't like. By his later years, he had ballooned to nearly 300 pounds and was reportedly carried around in a mechanical chair because walking was simply too much effort. And George IV's scandals weren't just personal, they were political too. His constant feuding with his father and later his ministers made governing Britain an absolute nightmare. During his time as Prince Regent, while George III was too mentally ill to rule, he threw lavish parties while the country was struggling with war and economic hardship. His obsession with self-image meant that he spent more time fussing over his outfits than actually running the nation. And let's not forget the countless parliamentary battles over his extravagant spending, his disastrous marriage, and his complete and utter refusal to behave like a king should. By the time George IV died in 1830, Britain collectively sighed in relief. Even his obituary writers struggled to find kind things to say. The Times called him a disgrace to the throne, while others simply noted that the less said about his reign, the better. Not exactly the legacy he had in mind. So, what can we learn from the scandal of George IV? First, that unchecked privilege and unlimited wealth don't necessarily make for great leadership. George IV had every advantage in life and still managed to be a disaster. And second, that public image matters. He spent his entire life trying to cultivate an air of grandeur, only to be remembered as an overindulgent buffoon. And finally, that marrying the wrong person can have consequences that stretch far beyond personal misery. It can shake an entire monarchy. So thank you for tuning into Outside View Scandals, where we dig into the most outrageous, ridiculous, and sometimes infuriating moments in history. And remember, the next time you think your family is dysfunctional, at least you don't have to stage a national trial to get rid of your spouse. Until next time, and the next video is already right here in the end screen.